In the heart of the desert, where silence speaks louder than words, and every shadow carries a story, a dusty saloon became the unlikely stage for something extraordinary. The night had begun like any other, boots stomping on wooden floors, laughter masked in whiskey, and the distant hum of danger riding on the wind. But when the humble cowboy walked in, head low and hat worn thin from years of solitude, no one noticed him. Not until the music slowed and the widow in the corner, the one draped in Apache black, rose from her seat with eyes like embers and offered him her hand. He didn't speak. He just nodded and followed her onto the floor, where the crowd parted like dry grass before a fire. What followed wasn't a performance. It was something ancient. Their steps weren't rehearsed, but remembered, like echoes from a forgotten song the earth itself once hummed. The cowboy's movements were rough, unpolished, shaped by years of hard labor. But the widow, she danced like she'd done it with spirits. And for the length of that song, the room held its breath. Some watched with awe. Others whispered tales of the woman's past. How she had buried a warrior chief with her own hands. How she hadn't danced since the night the stars bled. But none of that mattered when her hand touched the cowboy's chest. In that moment, something passed between them, something weightless, yet powerful enough to still the room. When the final note fell into silence, she leaned close and whispered something no one else could hear. And just like that, she left. By dawn, the saloon was empty. The only trace of what had happened was the cowboy, sitting alone by the well, holding in his hand a relic wrapped in deerskin, carved symbols pulsing faintly in the morning light. No one knew what it meant, but the look in his eyes had changed. The weight on his shoulders had shifted, and the ground beneath him, it seemed to recognize his steps now, as if the land itself had bowed its head in quiet recognition. What had she given him? Why did she choose him? And what power does a man truly inherit when a widow of the Apache offers more than a dance? When she offers memory, magic, and meaning in a single touch? That question echoed across the frontier long after the dust had settled, and this is the story that followed. The cowboy's name was Eli, though few knew it. Most just called him the Quiet One, a man who rode alone and asked nothing of the world except peace. He wasn't born of a tribe, nor did he claim a legacy, just a horse, a worn saddle, and a past he kept buried beneath his silence. The morning after the dance, Eli sat by the well as the first rays of sun kissed the land, his fingers brushing the carved object the widow had given him. It was warm despite the chill, and though he couldn't read the symbols, he felt them like echoes under his skin. He tried to go about his day, as he always did, checking his saddle straps, feeding the horse, nodding quietly to strangers. But something had shifted. Wherever he walked, animals stirred with unusual stillness, and the wind seemed to hum his name in a language older than memory. Children who used to avoid him now stared with quiet reverence, and the bartender, who had once dismissed him as just another drifter, offered him water without asking. There was a presence around Eli now, not heavy, but undeniable. Later that afternoon, he returned to the edge of town and found the widow sitting beneath a red cedar, weaving feathers into a braid of horsehair. She didn't look up when he approached. "You felt it," she said simply, as if it were a certainty. Eli nodded, unsure what to say. "What is it?" he asked, his voice rough with disuse. The widow smiled faintly. "It's not a gift," she replied. "It's a memory, one that belongs to the land, and now it's waking through you." Her words stirred something in him, something that had been sleeping for far too long. She told him of a time before the railroad, before the mines, when the Apache walked freely and the wind still obeyed the drums. There were men and women chosen by the elders, not warriors, not chiefs, but carriers of power, people through whom the land spoke, not in fire or thunder, but in stillness and truth. "You danced with me," she said, "but the spirits danced with you." Eli didn't know whether to believe her, but in the West, belief wasn't about logic. It was about listening to what the silence was trying to say. That night, dreams came, not of gunfights or past regrets, but of places he had never seen. Mesas lit by moonlight, rivers that whispered in forgotten tongues, mountains that bled fire when the sky wept. And in all of them, he walked alone until he didn't. until he felt the presence of something ancient walking beside him, guiding him. Eli woke before dawn, sweat on his brow, the relic still clutched in his hand. It hadn't just marked him. It had called something to him. And from that moment on, he could no longer ignore what was stirring. The next few days brought questions Eli wasn't ready to answer. A coyote began sleeping near his tent, its eyes always fixed on him. A hawk circled every time he stepped into the open, never diving, never drifting too far. The townspeople noticed. Whispers spread. That man doesn't cast the same shadow anymore. Some grew curious. Others grew afraid. And when the sheriff came asking what was in the pouch he wore now around his neck, Eli said only, "Something I don't understand yet." The sheriff didn't press further. Not when a sudden gust blew his hat clear off his head. Eli sought out the widow again, this time at the edge of the old burial ground. She was kneeling by a weathered stone, singing a song that had no words, only breath and memory. "You carry what my husband once carried," she said when he approached. "Before the cavalry came, before the land was scarred." Her eyes glistened, but did not break. He was taken before he could finish what he was called to do. But the spirits, they wait. And when they find someone worthy, they pass the burden forward. "You didn't choose this, but you answered." She led him deep into the forest, far from any path worn by horses or men. They arrived at a ring of stones, ancient, moss-covered, humming softly beneath the soil. "Place it there," she said. Eli hesitated, then laid the relic in the center. The ground trembled gently, and the air thickened as if the sky itself had leaned in to listen. In that sacred stillness, Eli felt memories not his own flood through his mind. Battles fought without steel, promises made to the earth, rivers blessed with ash and song. And at the center of it all, her, the widow, waiting. When the ritual ended, she placed a hand over his chest. "You will walk in two worlds now," she said. "One of men, one of meaning. And both will test you." Eli nodded slowly, not because he fully understood, but because he knew enough of pain to recognize when something true had been spoken. He walked out of that forest heavier, not with burden, but with awareness. He was still a cowboy, still quiet, still unsure. But now he was also something more. Something called, something watched. As he returned to town, even the horses moved aside as he passed. Children no longer whispered. They greeted him with wide eyes and soft smiles. And on the door of the saloon, someone had carved a new symbol, the same one etched into the relic now resting against his chest. Eli didn't know what came next, but the Old West didn't wait for answers. It waited for action. And for the first time in his life, the quiet cowboy wasn't just drifting toward nowhere. He was walking into a purpose that was older than dust. News of Eli spread beyond the town lines faster than any stagecoach. They said he could calm stampeding cattle just by looking at them, that wolves followed him not with hunger, but as guardians, and that he once stepped into a fight between two rival ranchers, spoke only once, and both men dropped their guns like children who'd forgotten why they were angry. Whether the stories were true or not didn't matter. In the West, stories had power. And now, Eli's name was being etched into that unspoken book where legends are written with dust and belief. But Eli remained unchanged in his ways. He didn't seek glory. He didn't ask for coin or recognition. Instead, he wandered to nearby settlements, to forgotten trails, to places where pain had taken root and people had stopped hoping. At an outpost ravaged by drought, he stood in silence beside a dried-up well for 3 nights. On the 4th morning, water began to trickle. At a ranch where a child hadn't spoken since her mother's death, he simply sat with her beneath a mesquite tree. By sundown, she whispered, "Thank you." The widow watched it all from a distance. She never followed, never interfered. She simply listened as the land began to breathe differently, as if a balance long broken was finding its rhythm again. She knew what it meant. Eli wasn't just carrying the relic. He was awakening what had been dormant. And that awakening came with cost. Power, in the old ways, was never about force. It was about weight, about bearing the stories, the wounds, the soul of the land itself. She had seen it devour men. She had buried one who carried too much. One day, as Eli rode through a canyon known for ambushes, he found himself surrounded by outlaws. 6 men, rough-faced and mean-eyed, with pistols drawn and laughter thick in their throats. "Heard you're some kind of ghost," one said. "Let's see if ghosts bleed." Eli didn't reach for his gun. He didn't flinch. He simply dismounted, placed his hand over the relic, and looked each man in the eye. What they saw there, it wasn't fear. It was knowing. And one by one, their hands lowered, as if something inside them remembered what it had tried to forget. They left without a shot fired. And Eli, once alone again in the canyon, looked to the sky. He didn't smile. He didn't feel triumphant, only tired. He understood now. This wasn't power. It was responsibility. Every life spared, every wound eased, came with a price. And though no one else could see it, the earth did. The way his shoulders hung lower, the way his footsteps grew heavier. Still he walked. Because once you carry the land's memory, you don't stop. Not until it tells you you've done enough. The wind carried warnings next. It howled through the trees at night, stirred ashes from fire pits left undisturbed. Animals grew restless. Birds flew lower. The elders in nearby tribes spoke in hushed tones, some pointing to ancient carvings that foretold of a walker between worlds. One who would rise in the time of great division to remind men of the old pacts made between flesh and soil. And now, they believed that Eli was that man, not because he claimed it, but because he bore the signs, the quiet, the strength, the sorrow. When Eli arrived in a small village near the edge of the northern border, he found homes burned, horses stolen, and fear carved into every face. The townsfolk had been attacked not by men, but by something else, a force no one could describe. Crops rotted overnight. Wells turned black. Children dreamed of fire and woke with ash in their palms. The sheriff, a woman named May, had held the town together as best she could, but she was weary. "We need more than guns now," she told Eli. "We need grace, and I don't know where to find it." Eli said nothing. He simply walked to the center of town, removed the relic from beneath his shirt, and placed it in the soil. Then he sat beside it and waited. For hours. Then overnight. No one dared disturb him. On the third morning, something shifted. Rain fell, not in torrents, but in quiet drops, soft as breath. The wind settled. The crops in the field, long dead, stood taller. And from the forest, deer approached without fear. May wept openly. "What are you?" she whispered. But Eli didn't answer. He never did. Word of the miracle spread, and with it, the fear of what it meant. Because for every force that heals, there is one that resents. Men with greed in their bones and hatred in their blood began to ride toward Eli. Not to learn, but to test. They called him false prophet, witch, traitor. One group carved a cross and burned it near the edge of town, daring him to come out. But Eli did not meet them with fire. He walked into the smoke with the same silence he always carried. And when they tried to raise their weapons, they couldn't. Their hands trembled. One man dropped to his knees. The townsfolk began to gather around him, not to protect, but to stand with. They saw in him not a savior, but a mirror, a reflection of what could be possible if mercy came before judgment. Eli didn't ask for followers. He didn't preach. He just stood where others had fallen. And in the Old West, where most men became legends through violence, he became one through presence, through stillness, through remembering what the land had whispered to him the moment he took that widow's hand and danced. Eli's legend rippled across the territory like the slow roll of thunder before a storm. But unlike other tales of the West, filled with gunfights, stolen gold, and blood-soaked revenge, his story moved differently. It didn't come in headlines or shout-bar songs. It arrived in silence, in the way people began to treat one another differently after crossing his path. A boy once known for thievery returned a stolen horse without being asked. A rancher ended a land dispute by offering his rival water during a drought. Wherever Eli passed, the land didn't just shift, people did. But change is never welcomed by all. In the town of Blackridge, where cold dust darkened the sky and money spoke louder than morals, a powerful man named Colton Grady ruled with a clenched fist. He heard the whispers about Eli, a man who calmed storms and silenced hate, and he saw danger, not promise. A man like that, he spat, makes others start asking questions, and questions lead to rebellion. Grady sent his men to find Eli, not to kill him, but to expose him, to strip the legend from the man, and remind folks who truly held power. When Eli arrived in Blackridge, he did so alone, unarmed, and without fear. Grady invited him to the town hall, offered him a drink, and laughed as he mocked the stories. "You think kindness makes you strong?" he sneered. "Out here, it gets you buried." Eli didn't flinch. He looked Grady in the eye and said calmly, "Then I'll make sure what's buried grows something better." The room fell quiet, not because the words were loud, but because they were true. Even Grady's men shifted uneasily. That night, Grady staged a spectacle, bringing Eli before the townspeople and daring him to perform. "Show us your power," he said. "Make it rain. Heal someone. Prove you're worth the myth." But Eli didn't move. He just looked over the crowd and said, "The power was never mine. It's in you. Every time you choose to lift someone instead of crushing them." The people stood still, unsure, and then a woman in the crowd, one of Grady's maids, her face bruised and weary, stepped forward and whispered, "I believe him." Others followed, one by one, not shouting, just standing. Grady roared, tried to regain control, but the crowd had already shifted, not because Eli fought him, but because Eli reminded them what strength really looked like. Grady's power, built on fear, cracked under the weight of simple courage. And when Eli left Blackridge the next morning, he did so without celebration. He tipped his hat, mounted his horse, and rode on, knowing that true change doesn't need applause. It only needs witnesses. As winter crept over the plains, Eli found shelter in a valley where time seemed to pause. The snow fell like silence, covering the earth in white hush. He built a small cabin with his own hands, just enough to keep the wind out and the fire warm. Visitors still came, a mother searching for peace, a wounded outlaw seeking forgiveness, a young man terrified of the violent thoughts in his own heart. Eli never offered answers. He only offered presence. And, somehow, that was always enough. One evening, the widow appeared again, her long coat dusted in snow, her eyes older, wiser. She entered without knocking, and they sat across from one another like old friends who didn't need to speak to understand. "The land is stirring," she said. "The old ones say a season is ending." Eli nodded. "I can feel it." She placed a new relic on the table, smaller, darker, carved from wood no longer found. "This is the last gift," she said, "but it's not for you. It's for the one who comes after." Eli stared at it for a long time. He understood then. His journey wasn't the end of something. It was the continuation of a memory passed from spirit to spirit, keeper to keeper. He wasn't the hero. He was the bridge. And soon, someone else would arrive, lost, angry, broken, and the dance would begin again. "Will they be ready?" he asked. The widow smiled. "Were you?" He let out a quiet laugh. "No," she leaned forward. "But you answered. And that's all the spirits ever ask." As she left, the snow thickened, but the cabin grew warmer. Eli stood in the doorway, watching her figure disappear into the white. He didn't feel sorrow. He felt stillness, completion. And in that silence, the wind whispered through the trees like a lullaby in a forgotten tongue. It told him that everything, the dance, the relic, the awakening, had been part of something larger than even the West itself. Something eternal. That night, as the fire crackled and the stars blinked over the frozen plains, Eli placed the second relic in a pouch, sealed it with leather, and set it beside the door. Then he closed his eyes, and for the first time in many years, he dreamed not of burden or sorrow, but of a child's hand reaching out in the dark and finding his. As days turned into weeks, the girl, whose name was Selah, began to absorb the rhythm of the valley. She learned to wake with the sun, to listen to the trees before stepping into the forest, to ask permission from the land before taking what she needed. Eli watched from a distance, never hovering, never teaching in the traditional sense. He knew that the kind of knowledge she needed couldn't be handed over like a lesson. It had a root, and with every sunrise, every moment she sat in silence, every dream she whispered aloud, the root grew deeper. Selah was different from him, more fire than wind. Where Eli moved quietly, she asked questions. Where he endured pain with silence, she allowed her tears to fall, unashamed. But that too was power. He saw in the way animals were drawn to her, how children followed her steps when she passed through nearby towns. Her presence disrupted routines, not because she demanded attention, but because people felt something in her, as if the land itself had sent her as a reminder. A force not forged in battle, but in the quiet courage of being tender in a torn world. One afternoon, Selah returned from the woods with a boy no older than 8. He was trembling, half-starved, unable to speak. She had found him hiding in the roots of a tree, clutching a piece of cloth stained with soot. Eli helped prepare a place by the fire, and they fed the boy slowly, wordlessly. That night, Selah sat awake, holding his hand as he slept. "He hasn't made a sound," she said. Eli nodded. "He will, when his spirit feels safe again." Selah looked at him, eyes sharp. "Then we wait, as long as it takes." And in that moment, Eli knew she was readying herself for a life of remembering others. But even as Selah grew stronger, the valley grew restless. The ground began to crack in places once fertile. Smoke appeared on distant horizons, not from hearths, but from fires meant to erase. Raiders, drawn by rumors of sacred objects and whispers of unseen power, were moving from town to town. They weren't after land or cattle. They were hunting myths. They believed that whoever carried the relics could bend the land to their will. And now, that meant Selah. That meant Eli. That meant a reckoning was drawing near, whether they wanted it or not. One evening, as a red sky settled over the hills, Selah stood at the edge of the ridge, clutching the pouch against her chest. "If they come," she said, "do we run?" Eli stood beside her, quiet for a long while. "We don't run," he answered. "We remember. And remembering is what they fear most." Selah didn't move. She let the wind press against her, let the moment brand itself into her bones. "Then let them come," she whispered. "I don't carry this so they'll fear me. I carry it so others don't have to anymore." And beside her, Eli nodded, not as a teacher, but as an equal. When the raiders came, it wasn't with noise. It was with silence, the kind that rots the air before violence. They moved through the neighboring towns like shadows with fire on their heels, burning stories, silencing elders, shattering sacred places. They didn't wear uniforms or ride under flags. They were the kind of men who had long since forgotten who they were, seeking power in the only thing they still understood: fear. And what they feared most was memory. They feared the ones who carried it. They feared what Selah had become. The valley prepared not with weapons, but with presence. Families stayed. Elders lit fires. The boy Selah had rescued stood at her side, still mute, but no longer afraid. Eli sat in the circle by the cedar tree, relic resting between his palms. "They want to erase," he said. "But fire can't burn what's carved into spirit." Selah stepped forward then, holding her own relic high. "We don't meet them with anger," she said. "We meet them with everything they've forgotten, with the land, with the ancestors, with truth." When the raiders entered the valley, they expected resistance. They expected violence. But what they saw stopped them cold. An entire community, standing silently, facing them, eyes steady. Children, elders, a mute boy holding Selah's hand. And in the center of it all, the girl they had come for. Not running, not hiding, just being. One man raised his rifle. But before he could aim, his horse reared, screaming, as if something unseen had grabbed its heart. Birds shrieked overhead. Wind howled through the canyons. The land itself responded. The raiders didn't understand it, but they felt it, the weight of something older than steel pressing down on their bones. One by one, their hands dropped. Some turned their horses around. Others fell to their knees, overcome not by fear, but by a sorrow they didn't recognize. A sorrow that didn't belong to them, but lived beneath the ground they'd desecrated for years. Selah stepped forward, voice like stone and water. "You are not my enemy," she said, "but I will not let you break what I was born to remember." They left, not because they were defeated, but because they were seen. And in the Old West, there is no deeper wound than having your violence mirrored back at you, untouched, unchanged, and unafraid. When the dust cleared, Selah turned to Eli, tears shining in her eyes. "We didn't win," she whispered. Eli nodded slowly. "No, we reminded them." And in the stillness that followed, the valley finally exhaled, as if the land itself had been holding its breath, waiting for someone brave enough to remember out loud. Time moved on, as it always does, but the valley never returned to what it was. It became something new, not louder, not grander, but deeper. Visitors came in quiet numbers, not to marvel, but to learn. They didn't ask Selah for miracles. They asked her to listen, and she did. She listened to every orphan child who came searching for a voice, to every farmer who arrived with soil in their hands and grief in their chest. She welcomed them not with answers, but with the space to breathe again. That, she knew, was the greatest gift Eli had ever given her. Eli himself grew slower with the seasons. His hands, once steady, now trembled slightly when he poured tea, but his eyes never lost their clarity. He watched Selah not as a guardian, but as a proud witness to what the world had almost lost, a spirit capable of standing, again and again, even after being shattered. One morning, as spring returned, he placed his own relic, the first one, in her hands. "It's time," he said. "You carry the story now." And she wept, not because she feared the weight, but because she recognized it. The day Eli passed, the entire valley went silent. No songs, no speeches, just silence. The kind he had always honored, the kind that speaks more than words. They laid him beneath the cedar, the roots curling gently around him, as if even the earth wanted to hold him a little longer. Selah didn't speak that day. She only knelt, hand over her heart, the relics hanging over her chest like the sun rises, not because they demand attention, but because they cannot be ignored. Years later, when children asked about the man in the stories, the one who danced with the Apache widow, who calmed storms with his silence, who turned memory into a weapon against cruelty, Selah would smile and say, "He didn't change the West. He reminded it of what it had once been." And that's how he lived on, not in stone or books, but in the way people stood a little taller, listened a little deeper, and remembered the kind of power that doesn't take but gives. And if someday, far from that valley, you find yourself alone in a world that seems too cruel, too loud, too broken, listen. You just might hear the wind whispering through the pines, not with answers, but with reminders. That once a humble cowboy danced with a widow, and the next day, the world changed. In a world carved by dust, fire, and forgotten promises, it wasn't a warrior or a gunslinger who reshaped the rhythm of the land. It was a quiet cowboy and a widow who carried the weight of memory in her bones. What began as a dance beneath flickering lamplight became a ripple through time, awakening spirits long asleep and truths buried beneath generations of noise. Eli didn't chase legacy. He walked towards stillness. And in doing so, he reminded everyone that real power doesn't shout. It listens. It heals. It remembers. The journey wasn't about saving the world, but about reconnecting it to its stories, to its roots, to its unseen wounds. Selah didn't inherit a throne or a crown. She inherited a memory and made it matter. The relics she carries aren't magical objects. They are pieces of pain transformed into protection, suffering turned into sacredness. Through her, the land found its voice again. Through her, we're reminded that every act of kindness echoes farther than we'll ever see, and that sometimes the greatest strength is simply choosing to feel in a world that tells us to forget. This story challenges the idea that legends are built through violence. Instead, it dares to suggest that the strongest ones are those who stay when it's easier to run, who stand still when storms demand chaos, and who carry the burden not because they want to, but because they know someone has to. Eli didn't change the West with bullets. He changed it by remembering and passing that memory forward. That's a power no empire, no outlaw, no fire can erase. So as the dust settles on this tale, ask yourself, what are you choosing to carry? Are you walking with the noise of the world, or are you listening to the quiet voice that dares to remember what truly matters? Because the relic may be fictional, but the choice is real. And each of us, in our own way, carries something sacred, something that can shape the world around us, if we dare to let it. If this story stirred something in you, don't let it stop here. Subscribe to the channel to walk alongside more stories that challenge, inspire, and heal. Like the video if Eli's journey left a mark, and share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this story stayed with you? Let your voice be part of this memory we're building together. Because in a world of endless noise, stories like these need you to keep them alive.